Hello there and welcome to our Alt24 special coverage over the Ukraine-Russia war, the so-called special military operation. Ukraine's army said it launched an airstrikes on Zemyeny Island, also known as Snake Island, causing significant losses to Russian forces. The military's Southern Operational Command said it had undertaken a made strikes with the use of various forces, and the military operation was continuing. The military situation for Ukraine's defenders in the eastern Donbass is extremely difficult. Officials have said there are 568 civilians thought to be holed up in Severodonetsk's Azot chemical plant as Russian attacks intensify in an effort to capture the city and the neighboring Lysychansk. Sergei Haidai, the governor of the Lugansk region, said. On the other side, Moscow's response to Lithuania's ban on the transit of goods sanctions by the EU to the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad will not be exclusively diplomatic but practical in NATO. The Foreign Ministry Press Secretary Maria Zakharova said. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by a Skype platform or the Zoom platform by Dr. Oleksiy Semeny from Ukraine, Director of the Institute for the Global Transformation in Kiev, and Mr. Ulf Sandmark, co-founder of the Belt and Road Institute and chairman of the Schiller Institute in Sweden. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let's tackle this report. Ukrainian forces launched a renewed assault on Snake Island in the Black Sea. Recent strikes suggested that Ukrainian forces were using powerful Western anti-ship weapons that threatened to undermine Russian naval domination.
The Russian Defense Ministry said on Tuesday that air defense successfully repelled a Ukrainian assault on Zemyeny Island, also known as Snake Island in the Baltic Sea. Spokesman Igor Konashenkov said Ukrainian forces used at least 15 drones and rocket fire to support the failed attack, which he said was abandoned before any troops reached the island.
Russian air defense assets eliminated on the enemy's means of destruction launched at the Snake Island. 13 unnamed aerial vehicles, 4 Tushka-U missiles and 21 Uragan multiple launch rocket system ordnance were shot down. None of the Ukrainian fire units reached its target on the Snake Island. The failed assault forced the enemy to give up landing troops on the island.
In the meantime, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met with Luxembourg's Prime Minister Javier Bettel in Kiev. During a joint press conference, Luxembourg Prime Minister expressed the European Union willingness to send a strong signal to Ukraine by granting it the status of candidate country for the European club at the end of this week.
I have a great principle. I must confess to you, Mr. President. If I ask someone for their opinion because I want to base myself on it, I have the principle that I respect that opinion. Otherwise, in this case, there is no point in doing it. So I hope that the European Union too, this Thursday and Friday, will manage to give this signal, which is strong for you, but strong for us too. Because it's not just the Ukrainian war, it's also the defense for the values for which many people died.
This statement came after a full consensus emerged to grant Ukraine and Moldova candidate status for European Union during talks between the 27 European Union affairs ministers meeting in Luxembourg.
Dr. Semeny, let me say that the Russian troops succeeded and could manage to take control over the eastern part of the country in general and the Donbass region precisely. The question is, what would be the next move? Will Russia keep moving toward another target, or it will stop over that target precisely and make it a Russian land for good?
to clarify, because it's very important to be clear in definitions. Russia did not succeed, and I suppose will not succeed, to take over eastern Ukraine. The fights are going in part of Donbas, not the whole Donbas, parts of Donbas, where it's really, it was possible for Russia for the last, I would suppose, 8 weeks to gain approximately, depends on the territory, 10 to 20 kilometers of distance in one or another directions. So of course, after, if they complete the task over Donbas, which is now in very large vicinity of months because of our fierce fighting, and despite all resources Russia put in this fighting, still Russians did not succeed to get their at least minimum aims. But afterwards, of course, they will try to get more. Now, what I see from the political reason, they, according to their political statements and in general some logics, they would like to have the control over Donbas in full, plus actually nowadays occupied southern territories. So this southern line going to Kherson and then to Crimea, to have this, let's call it, landscape bridge. I suppose that they will fail due to many reasons. First, because actually, and it's about even the history of your country, when you fought and quite successfully for your independence against France, if you're fighting for your country, for your nation, at your land, you will be successful if you are determined to be successful and to fight. And we are determined that we will fight. So the Russians, strategically, they will fail in any case. But from the tactical reasons, okay, there could be some setbacks, gains and losses. But then at the end of the day, it will be about decisiveness to fight, resources available, and actually readiness to sustain any kind of pressure. So nowadays, yes, this year until the summer, I expect that actually military actions will take place more and more, maybe with some kind of small pauses or even breaks, but unfortunately this fight will go on. But afterwards, I suppose there will be an understanding that it's much more better for Russia, I mean now, just to set on the table to agree on something. Because now more and more, it's not going to be just an aggression against Ukraine. More and more, it is going to have quite disastrous effects in Russia. With every month going this war, more and more danger is not just only for Ukraine, because we are suffering this aggression, but more and more danger is for Russia in itself, for Russian state, be it territorial or be it in structural terms.
Quite understood. Thank you so much for this clarification. Mr. Olv, Ukraine, if Ukraine could save its eastern parts of the country from the Russians, would that be safe enough to secure the whole country, or there will be measures to be taken for a better and strong protection? If so, what kind of protection it could be provided without being a NATO member?
Well, actually, it is not the Russians that are going to want to go forward primarily. It's the NATO and the West who wants to keep the hegemony over the world. So they want to use this war and use the Ukrainians, to the last Ukrainians, to get to Russia, to try to crush Russia economically. And in the next step, in the Madrid meeting, they are about to launch campaigns to contain China too, militarily. So what we see is a global war policy from the NATO side, and they are sacrificing the Ukrainians in this fight. So what we have now is a very, very dangerous situation. It's like close to a world war situation, a nuclear war. And this means this war has to stop very soon. And also for the Ukrainians, they have basically lost the war. They are losing now so many soldiers. They will not be able to keep the fighting, as NATO says. NATO Stoltenberg says he wants to have a long war, but this is not possible when they are losing about 500 a battalion every day. So what we need now is to have an agreement where Ukraine and Russia must come to an agreement as soon as possible for the sake of Ukraine, to keep parts of Ukraine. And this is the deal that was offered already before the war, the Minsk agreements. These agreements are favorable for Ukraine to be a neutral country and to be preserved as a nation. And you could see from the Russian military campaign already from the beginning, it was not meant to take the whole of Ukraine. Then you would need 1 million army. They didn't put this type of resources into the fight. So it means that they were only going for limited operations. And I think they have succeeded what they wanted to have now. Basically, maybe some more now in the Donbass. But if Ukraine can come to a peace as soon as possible, that would be the best for Ukraine. Probably, yes.
Perfect. All right, moving on to the second point. The spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, said on Wednesday that Moscow's response to Lithuania's ban on the transit of goods sanctions by the EU to the Russian city of Kaliningrad will not be exclusively diplomatic, but practical in nature.
One of the main questions has been about whether the response to Lithuania stopping some Russian cargo trains transiting its territory to Kaliningrad region would be exclusively diplomatic. The answer, no. The response will not be diplomatic, but rather practical in nature.
This example shows that you cannot trust either verbal statements by the West or written ones. Russia will certainly respond to such hostile actions. Appropriate measures are being worked out between departments and will be taken in the near future. Their consequences will have a serious negative impact on the population of Lithuania.
Mr. Semeni, coming back to you, how can you consider this Russian threat to Lithuania after this latter's refusal to allow some goods to cross to the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad? Would Russia launch another military operation over Lithuania if they didn't change their status?
Frankly speaking, now you cannot exclude any kind of option of Russian activities as it is seen since the start of the war against Ukraine. But even under these circumstances, it would be fully stupid for Russia now to try to militarily solve the issue, because if you take very clearly, it is not the issue of blocking any transport from Russia to this exclave of Kaliningrad through Belarus mainly. It is the issue that some goods, or quite a huge amount of the goods, are now under the sanctions imposed by the European Union. And Lithuania, as a part of the European Union, is just implementing the list of these sanctions. I suppose, of course, there is now the possibility of the talks between the European Union and Russia about concrete question. It is very emotional one. I will not exclude some incidents there and some kind of just game who has the better nerves. But in general, I would suppose that the case of military conflict, because it will be immediately Article number 5 of NATO treaty, and the whole NATO actually engaged into the war and means nuclear threat, it will be fully stupid for Russia already being stuck in Ukraine and just trying to have another war which will or would have immediately disastrous effect for the whole Russia. Once more, even now by the conflict with Ukraine, war against Ukraine, Russia is on the verge of very tragical situation for itself, for its statehood in the middle-term perspective. Adding to this aggression against Lithuania, it will mean that actually this end will be much more closer even in maybe this year or the next year. So in general, after the Russian actions, I would not exclude anything, but from practical terms, I would suppose that the war for this so-called Suwalki corridor, so against Lithuania, it should be actually not the basis scenario.
Quite understood. Mr. Olaf, you are aware of the NATO moves and strategic plans of this alliance. Will they keep watching over the escalation happening between Russia and Lithuania, or NATO countries will have something to say if Russia moves aggressively to find a solution for its shipments to Kaliningrad? And what are you saying about what Mr. Dr. Semeni has stated, that it is a stupid move for Russia to launch another military operation?
Well, I agree it would be very, very dangerous. But what we see here with this measure from Lithuania is that the European Union and the West and NATO only has one answer to the whole crisis, and that is escalation. Escalation, and this means also that they are about to go into the war. The British new chief of the army said Britain must prepare now for land war with this army. We had the head of the German Marshall Fund who said Europe must provide Ukraine with more weapons, but she also said we have to bring out the tactical nuclear weapons. So when Mr. Osikov speaks about the game here, what he speaks about is a nuclear game. It's a brinksmanship to try to pressure Russia on the edge of a nuclear war to make concessions. And this is very, very dangerous because that could trigger a full nuclear war. A tactical nuclear war is not just a small war. It will always expand into full nuclear war. So this kind of games is very, very dangerous. We have to come to immediately, European Union must stop this kind of provocation, and also there must come to an agreement. The problem is every time Ukraine and Russia comes to an agreement, there is a provocation, and then the British Boris Johnson flies in and tells Ukraine not to have any agreement. So this is the policy from the war hawks to keep the war until you get this kind of brinksmanship close to a nuclear war, and this is very, very dangerous. And this is the policy to try to break the power of Russia and China and keep the hegemony of the West over the whole world.
Perfectly understood. Coming back to you, Dr. Semeni, do you agree with what Mr. Olf is saying, that they are pushing the escalation forward? Probably they will damage the world with the nuclear war, and this is the idea. They are just putting the escalation forward to weaken Russia.
I don't agree, because it's just a game which we Ukrainians quite well understand and understood, and now I suppose many Western countries now understand. Russia is pokering. Russia is pokering because it is not capable to impose nuclear arsenal against the West, because they do understand after they fire the first launch, they will be fired from the other side, and the game will be over for everybody. So it was very good agreement during the Cold Times War that actually nobody threatened another side with a real nuclear attack. And now the Russians, having no more actually instruments, hard instruments in their game, they are trying just to bully those in the West who are very fearful or who don't understand the Russian psychology, that we are guys without no limits, we are ready to nuclear fight, although they don't have this capacity to really serious to go into nuclear fight. But this is like some kind of political game. Until now, Mr. Putin succeeded in just threatening some Western leaders, or in general some parts of the society in the West, that he is or Russia is seriously thinking about this, let's call it, nuclear option. Although if you take this seriously and just analyze the whole structure of the Russian allied, of their composition, of their way of thinking, what they are looking forward to, then you can understand that this is like a game. This is like a game to threaten another side in order to get something from this psychological means. And beforehand, unfortunately, the game was successful for Russia. So this just threatening and then getting some results. Now, the game is over in this way.
The game is over. Thank you ever so much for this explanation. Now, moving on, the United States said Tuesday it stood firmly behind Lithuania and NATO commitments to defend it after Russia warned its neighbor of restrictions on rail transit to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad.
Stand by the commitments that we have made to the NATO alliance. That includes, of course, a commitment to Article 5. That is the bedrock of the NATO alliance. This is a campaign that includes dozens of countries around the world, including blocks of countries, in this case, the EU, but also individual countries using their national authorities. Lithuania has been a stalwart partner in this. We stand by NATO, we stand by our NATO allies, and we stand by Lithuania.
Mr. Olf, let's be clear to one point. Russia's main target behind this military operation was to stop over the NATO expansion within the Eastern European countries. But now, Scandinavian countries apply to join this alliance, and even the Balkan countries dare to close their airspace for the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov last week. To this point, don't you think that Russia has failed to reach its main goal, which is preventing NATO to be enlarged precisely near the Russian borders?
Well, the main goal of Russia is to keep the negotiations for peace with the West. It was the West who canceled all the nuclear agreements, and what we see now is the West who is speaking about using nuclear weapons, both on the Pacific side and here in the European side too. We have the head of the British RUSI Institute, who is a very prestigious security institute in Britain, who said what the policy is from Britain is to cook the Russians like a frog. It means they will cook them slowly, but not have them to jump out of the bottle, because they want to cook them all the way up until a nuclear crisis around Crimea. And this would mean that on the brinks of that, they would be able to pressure Russia. This is official statement from this strategic institute from the British side. The American side also have the global prompt strategy. They have the lightning exercise in the Pacific. So they are pulling out the nuclear weapons and threatening with this. That's the danger was that Ukraine would get nuclear weapons. And that's what's one of the triggers why this war even started. If there would have been an acceptance of Ukraine or NATO to have Ukraine not joining NATO, then this would have been immediately a reason not to have this war. So this means that it's a very, very dangerous situation. And even this Scandinavian approach to NATO is also very dangerous, because we are close to the biggest concentration of nuclear weapons in the world, which is the Murmansk basis of the naval Russian Navy, where the nuclear submarines are based, who are supposed to be able to deliver a second strike. So if they are threatened now with the closeness of NATO, 180 kilometers from Murmansk, it means that the whole balance of nuclear weapons is out of the window. So this is an unacceptable threat to Russia. So we are close to also nuclear crisis like Cuban Missile Crisis in the north around Scandinavia, but it could come even sooner now around Lithuania.
Understood, Mr. Olf. Now let's hear to the Stoltenberg statement. Mr. Semeni, it seems now we have a different kind of confrontation. It's all about long-range missiles and the new system weapons. So if Ukraine could have been given what Zelensky is still pleading for, I mean more heavy weapons, would that help Ukraine to win against Russia, or it will only buy them more time? In other words, to prolong this operation as Putin claimed?
First of all, just one disclaimer on beforehand. By all my respect to the counterpart, I would disagree with the notions that actually the war was because it was some kind of plan to join NATO from Ukraine, or it was some questions about being Ukraine armed with some nuclear arsenals. Mr. Zandmark, you should be very careful with the statements, because it doesn't A, correspond to reality, B, it fully to 100% is equal to Russian narratives and to Russian statements, official statements. Be careful transferring these Russian messages through this. But then to your question, actually, unfortunately, now the war is going to be quite a prolonged war. Unfortunately, both sides are trying to actually to be very tough in their fights, to gain as much as it is possible from the Russian side and to defend as much as possible from Ukrainian side, to gain every possible resources. With regard to Western assistance, Ukrainians would like to have it more, just in order to be capable to counterattacks. Unfortunately, it's still not the case. But in any case, what I told, this is like a tactical nature, which will be many months, unfortunately, ahead. But from the strategic point of view, at the end of the day, sooner or later, it will be the defeat of Russia in the sense of the proclaimed Russian aims for this, as they call, special operation, or as it is really, the war, because Russia will not be capable to conquer Ukraine. Russia will not be capable to make us to surrender to Russia. And at the end of the day, it will be a huge defeat for Russia itself, transferring this defeat in many negative consequences inside of Russia. Unfortunately, we Ukrainians will have, and we pay already quite a huge price for this, but we have no other choice. This is our country, this is our land, we will fight, and we will actually, at the end of the day, will win. The question is when and to what price?
1-to-1 price. Mr. Semini is saying that be careful because the message you are transmitting is a Russian message. And back to the 21st of May last month, Ukraine's President Zelensky said that only diplomacy can end the war in Ukraine. At the same time, now he is still calling the Western allies to keep delivering weapons, and he keep encouraging his soldiers to fight until the end. Isn't that a sort of contradiction?
No, because if you take the whole phrase or the whole position of the president, it is logical. You just cut it on the one half. Because President Zelensky is official, and he told from the very first day, he is ready for negotiations, personally with Mr. Putin or with Russian leadership, and the negotiations would be much better than having the war. Mm-hmm. But negotiations, and now this is official position of Ukraine, can start, when the ceasefire is in place, and secondly, when Russian troops withdraw from the occupied territories. And
Perfect.
Afterwards, Ukrainians are ready to any negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Mr. Olf, what are you saying about this? He's saying that you are transmitting a Russian message.
Well, my message is not mine. It's President Zelensky who, in the meeting in Munich in February this year, and the big military summit there, said that he wanted Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. So this was almost a trigger for the war. So it is not my saying. This comes from your president. So the problem here is that we have a situation where there is a provocation, one after the other, to expand NATO and to expand the war as long as possible, and this has to be stopped. There is more and more people from the world who calls for a stop. The president of Indonesia, Widodo, said that he will bring this message now to end the war when he comes to the meeting of the G7. So we will have a big international debate about this, where this war has to stop, and we have to go over to more policy of security. The problem with NATO is that throughout the international law, when they said you could join NATO and be free to join NATO any time for members like Sweden or others, this was wrong, because according to the international law, you are not allowed to increase your security at the expense of other nations. This is in the OSCE treaties, it's in the United Nations. This is international law. But the West is following the rules-based order, which means it's an order where they decide what is right and wrong.
Quite understood. All right, moving on to discuss the last point, because we are running out of time. An estimated of 60,000 demonstrators gathered in front of the Georgian parliament, waving European and Georgian flags, days after the European Commission suggested waiting before granting Tbilisi candidate status. Several pro-European organizations and all the opposition groups had called for March for Europe on Monday evening in Tbilisi. The rally goal is to send a signal to Brussels.
This gathering is an illustration of our unity and strength. We want to show our common conviction and say today that we are part of the European family.
Dr. Semini, staying with you, Georgia has been ruled since decades by oligarchs, and the well-known ex-politician Bidzina Ivanishvili, the billionaire founder of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, who kind of has a strong ties with Russians. Do you think that this letter will be an obstacle to grant Georgia the EU application, taking into consideration one of the EU rules, de-oligarchization?
Actually, before answering, I would just once more be careful for Mr. Zenmark. Firstly, he disseminated open lies. President Zelensky never told that Ukraine is going to acquire a nuclear arsenal. You can take, I was at Munich Security Conference, you can take the transcript. This is fully Russian narrative. President Zelensky never told this. And I just intensified this. You should just make some clauses, because it's very dangerous to disseminate such lies. Secondly, there is no, in international law, your phrase about that the sovereignty or security of some country should not be somehow influenced by other countries. This is the clause in Paris Charter, if you do know exactly the documents. I do know, I'm a professional diplomat. So, but the first statement is about actually territorial integrity and sovereignty of each country. There is some contradiction. What each country means under influence from other countries to its own security. It's the issue of debate. But there is no clause in international law, and regardless of even United Nations. This is only in Paris Charter, adopted by all of the states almost 30 years ago. But then, come back to your question, actually. I suppose in Georgia, the situation is quite difficult because you mentioned it's not for decades, but since 2012, the country is actually ruled by one party which is connected to one oligarch. And this is exactly the reason, maybe, why the decision of European Commission or the proposal of European Commission last week was exactly to grant to Ukraine and Moldova the possibility of being candidate of EU member and not granting this possibility for Georgia. Unfortunately, our Georgian friends should confess that some part of the reason is exactly due to their behavior, their policy, be it their prime minister or be it some persons behind. And this is something should be done, but it's not a situation without any solution, because actually there was a proposal from the European Commission to grant for Georgia, let's call it pre-candidate status. So it could be changed in one half of the year, maybe in another summit. So there is no dead end, but this is clear, the signal from the European Union for the people in Georgia that you people in Georgia should change something in your own country before being accepted as a real candidate for the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Semeni. Mr. Ulf Sandmark, briefly, please, 1 minute left to end the show. What are you saying about what Mr. Semeni is saying that this is wrong from a statement from Zelensky?
Well, the situation is that he said that, and Ukraine has this capacity to get nuclear weapons, actually. The problem is that we have a situation where this idea of threatening your neighbors is not possible in a nuclear war situation. Mr. Bosiko is very adventurous in his statements when he's speaking about playing with this situation. We must come to peace immediately now, because the escalation is so dangerous, and we are in a war situation. And already in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was from the United States side, they didn't allow to have any nuclear weapons close to their nation. And this is the policy that is now clear also for today in the international law. You cannot have this expansion.
Quite understood. I'm sorry to cut you to thought, Mr. Ulf Sandmark, but we have reached the end of our time for this show. Mr. Ulf Sandmark, co-founder of the Belt and Road Institute and chairman of the Shoal Institute in from Sweden, thank you so much. Dr. Semeni Alexei, director of the Institute of Global Transformation, also thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on AL24 News. Take care of yourself and have a blessed day.